Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to Holes, chapters 31 through 35. Stanley angrily dug his shovel into the dirt. He was angry at everyone: Mr. Pandansky, the warden, Zigzag, X-Ray, and his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. But mostly, he was angry at himself. He knew he never should have let Zero dig part of his hole for him. He still could have taught him to read. If Zero could dig all day and still have the strength to learn, then he should have been able to dig all day and still have the strength to teach. What he should do, he thought, was go out after Zero. But he didn't. None of the others helped him dig Zero's hole, and he didn't expect them to. Zero had been helping him dig his hole. Now he had to dig Zero's. He remained on the lake digging during the hottest part of the day, long after everyone else had gone in. He kept an eye out for Zero, but Zero didn't come back. It would have been easy to go out after Zero. There was nobody to stop him. He kept thinking that's what he should do. Maybe they could climb to the top of Big Thumb. If it wasn't too far away, and if it really was the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge. So refuge is a great word. An area where you are safe or sheltered. So he found shelter there, and he said about the part of being under God's thumb. No one knew what he really meant. So they could climb to the top of Big Thumb if it wasn't too far away, and if it really was the same place where his great-grandfather found refuge. And if, after 100 years or so, water was still there. Remember, in this area, there was water until it was cursed. It didn't seem likely, not when an entire lake had gone dry. And even if they did find refuge on Big Thumb, he thought, they'd still have to come back here eventually. Then they'd both have to face the warden and her rattlesnake fingers. Instead, he came up with a better idea, although he didn't have it quite all figured out yet. He thought that maybe he could make a deal with the warden. He'd tell her where he really found the gold tube if she wouldn't scratch Zero. He wasn't sure how he'd make this deal without getting himself in deep trouble. She might just say, "Tell me where you found it or I'll scratch you too." Plus, it would mean X-Ray would get in trouble too. She'd probably scratch him up as well. X-Ray would be out to get him for the next 16 months. He dug his shovel into the dirt. By the next morning, Zero still hadn't returned. Stanley saw one of the counselors sitting guard by the water spigot outside the shower wall. That's like an attachment, like a faucet, where water would come out. Mr. Pandansky had 2 black eyes and a bandage over his nose. "I always knew he was stupid," Stanley heard him say. Stanley was required to dig only one hole the next day. As he dug, he kept a constant watch out for Zero, but never saw him. Once again, he considered going out on the lake to look for him, but he began to realize that it was already too late. His only hope was that Zero had found God's thumb on his own. It wasn't impossible. His great-grandfather had found it. For some reason, his great-grandfather had felt the urge to climb to the top of that mountain. Maybe Zero would feel the same urge. If it was the same mountain, if water was still there. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't impossible. There had been a storm just a few days ago. Maybe Big Thumb was actually some kind of natural water tower that caught and stored the rain. It wasn't possible. He returned to the tent to find the warden, Mr. Sir, and Mr. Pandansky all waiting for him. "Have you seen Zero?" the warden asked him. "No." "No sign of him at all?" "No." "Do you have any idea where he went?" "No." "You know, you're not doing him any favors if you're lying," said Mr. Sir. "He can't survive out there for more than a day or two." "I don't know where he is." All three stared at Stanley as if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. Mr. Pandansky's face was so swollen he could barely open his eyes. They were just slits. "You sure he has no family?" the warden asked Mr. Pandansky. "He's a ward of the state," Mr. Pandansky told her. "He was living on the streets when he was arrested." Now, that kind of means that he doesn't have any parents per se that are in charge of him, somewhat like an orphan, but he also may have been homeless if he was living on the streets. So more than likely, the inference you can make here is they are somewhat worried that maybe something terrible has happened and they'll get in trouble. But if no one has family ties to Zero, then nobody can raise a fuss. "Well, is there anyone who might ask questions?" "Some social workers who took an interest in him." Social worker in this case is like a guidance counselor. "He had nobody," said Mr. Pandansky. "He was nobody." The warden thought a moment. "Okay, I want you to destroy all of his records." Mr. Pandansky nodded. "He was never here," said the warden. Mr. Sir nodded. "Can you get into the state files from our computer?" she asked Mr. Pandansky. "I don't want anyone in the AG," means the Attorney General, like a higher office of law in a state, the AG's office, to know where he was here. "I don't think I can erase him completely from all the state files," said Mr. Pandansky. "Too many cross-references, but I can make it so it would be very difficult for anyone to ever find a record of him. Like I said, though, no one will ever look. No one cares about Hector Zeroni." "Good," the warden said. Chapter 32. 2 days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian, but X-Ray called him Twitch because he was always fidgeting. Twitch was assigned Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Vacancy is a great word too, so when there's something unoccupied, it's left unused. And so quickly that bed was filled up, just like Stanley had taken the bed from Barf Bag. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hotwire, which means to start, the engine, all in less than 1 minute. "I never planned to, steal one," he told them, "but sometimes, I'll be walking past a real nice car parked in a deserted area, and, I'll just start twitching. And if you think I twitch now, well, you should see me when I'm around a car. The next thing I know, I'm behind the wheel." Stanley lay on his scratchy sheets. It occurred to him that his cot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away or if he had just gotten used to it. "Hey, caveman," said Twitch, "do you really have to get up at 4:30? "You get used to it," Stanley told him. "It's the coolest part of the day." He tried not to think about Zero. It was too late. Either he'd made it to Big Thumb or... Well, what worried him the most, however, wasn't that it was too late. What worried him the most, what really ate at his insides, was the fear that it wasn't too late. Well, what if Zero was still alive, desperately crawling across the dirt, searching for water? He tried to force the image out of his mind. The next morning, out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told Twitch the requirements for his hole. as wide and as deep as your shovel. Twitch fidgeted. His fingers drummed against the wooden shaft of the shovel, and his neck moved from side to side. You won't be twitching so much after digging all day, Mr. Sir told him. You won't have the strength to wiggle your pinky. He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, deftly chewed on them, and spat out the shells. So when you're doing something deftly, you're doing it in a manner that's quick, skillful, sometimes thought of as in a clever way. So he was pretty practiced at doing this routine. And again, he says, this isn't a Girl Scout camp. The water truck came shortly after sunrise. Stanley got in line behind Magnet and ahead of Twitch. What if it's not too late? He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot, dry dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive after more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He'd need a car or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water in the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir had left the keys in the ignition. That's where you start a car. He slowly backed away from the line, then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window. The keys were there, dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took a deep breath to steady himself and try to think clearly. He had never driven before. How hard could it be? This is really crazy, he told himself. Whatever he did, he knew he'd have to do it quickly before Mr. Sir noticed. It's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived, but what if it wasn't too late? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. But if there wasn't time to think, he flung open the door to the truck and quickly climbed inside. Hey, shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key, stepped on the gas pedal. The engine revved. The truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal to the floor. The engine roared, but the truck was motionless. Mr. Sir came running around the side of the truck. The door was still open. Put it in gear, shouted Twitch. Remember, he loves cars, must know a lot about them. The gear shift was on the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back into the arrow pointed to the letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward. That's a great word, too. Ooh. So when you make a quick, abrupt jump, in this case, the car kind of jerked forward. Stanley jerked back against the seat and tightly gripped the wheel as the truck accelerated. His foot was pressed to the floor. The truck went faster and faster across the dry lake bed. It bounced over a pile of dirt. Suddenly, Stanley was slammed forward, then instantly backward as an airbag exploded in his face. He fell out of the open door and onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay on the dirt, staring at the truck, which stuck lopsided into the ground. He sighed. He couldn't blame his no good, dirty, rotten, pig stealing great grandfather this time. This time it was his own fault, 100%. He had probably just done the stupidest thing he had ever done in his short and miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore, but he didn't think he had broken any bones. He glanced back at Mr. Sir, who remained where he was, staring at Stanley. He ran. His canteen was strapped around his neck. It banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit again, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. Chapter 33. He slowed to a walk. As far as he could tell, nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices coming from back by the truck, but couldn't make out the words. Occasionally, he'd hear the revving of the engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He headed in what he thought was the direction of Big Thumb. He couldn't see it through the haze. Walking helped calm him down and allowed him to think clearly. He doubted he could make it to Big Thumb, and with no water in his canteen, he didn't want to risk his life on the hope that he'd find refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that. But he was in no hurry. It would be better to return later, after everyone had a chance to calm down. And as long as he'd come this far, he might as well look for Zero. He decided he would walk as long as he could until he was too weak to go any further, and then he'd turn around and go back. He smiled as he realized that wouldn't quite work. He would only go halfway as far as he thought he could go, so that he'd still have the strength to return. Then he'd have to make a deal with the warden, tell her where he found Kate Barlow's lipstick tube, and beg for mercy. That's a great word, too. So forgiveness, compassion, looking for her to be kind. He was surprised by how far out the holes extended. He couldn't even see the camp compound anymore, but he still kept passing holes. And just when he thought he'd passed the last hole, he'd come across another cluster of them, a little farther away. Back at the compound, they had dug in a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck. But out here, there was no system. It was as if every once in a while, in a fit of frustration, the warden would just pick a spot at random and say, "What the hell? Dig here." It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in a lottery. Stanley found himself looking down into each hole he passed. He didn't admit to himself what he was looking for. After more than an hour had gone by, he thought he had surely seen the last hole. But then, off to the left, he saw another cluster of them. He didn't actually see the holes. He saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole. His heart stopped. Down at the bottom was a family of yellow, spotted lizards. Their large red eyes looked up at him. He leapt back over the mound and ran. He didn't know if they were chasing after him. He thought he might have seen one leap out of the hole. He ran until he couldn't run any farther, then collapsed. They hadn't come after him. He sat there a while and caught his breath. And as he got back to his feet, he thought he noticed something on the ground, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like much, maybe just a big rock. But in a land of nothingness, any little thing seemed unusual. He walked slowly toward it. The encounter with the lizards had made him very cautious. It turned out to be an empty sack of sunflower seeds. He wondered if it was the same one that Magnet had stolen from Mr. Sir, although that didn't seem likely. He turned it inside out and found one seed stuck to the burlap. Lunch. Chapter 34. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk for no more than another hour, maybe two, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all thirsty. Maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and he didn't know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away, a yard is 3 feet, from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened them to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. He hurried toward it. The pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage. I want you to think about what mirage could be. There really wasn't any water. It was a mirage. So it's basically an illusion. It's like you're seeing things, like a hallucination. And in this case, he probably has heat stroke. He's overheated, so he's starting to see and imagine things caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising off the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he might find something to put it in. And after a while, he thought he could make out the shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if this was another kind of mirage, like a hallucination. But the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. And almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with its thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain, it was more than halfway. He kept walking towards it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there. But every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem likely that a tree would grow here. More likely, it was a ridge of dirt or rocks. The object, whatever it was not on the way to Big Thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or continue towards Big Thumb, or maybe just turn around. There was no point in heading toward Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object. He changed directions. He doubted it was anything, but the fact that there was something in the middle of all of this nothing made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object his halfway point, and he hoped he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of this dry and barren wasteland. After all, he realized, this was once a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could very well die of thirst. The name of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled and faded, but Stanley could read the name, Mary Lou. Take a minute to think about whose boat that once belonged to. On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt and a tunnel leading down below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred under the boat. It was coming out. "Hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry, and it was hard to shout very loudly. "Hey!" the thing answered weakly. Then a dark hand and an orange sleeve reached up out of the tunnel. Guess who it is? Think about it. Chapter 35. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out too many days past Halloween, half rotten, with sunken eyes and a drooping smile. "Is that water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not quite believing that he was real. "I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but," he smiled sheepishly, "it drove it into a hole. I can't believe you're—" "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we gotta get back to camp." Zero shook his head. "I'm not going back." "You have to. We both have to." "You want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. "It's cooler under the boat," he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through his hole. It was a miracle that he was still alive. But Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him, and he was just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He never would have fit when he first came to Camp Green Lake. He'd lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his legs struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there, but then remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Pandansky. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt, and there were enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, now the roof, to provide light and ventilation. Ventilation means air. He could see empty jars scattered about. I want you to think about jars. Why would there be jars there? Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. "What is it?" "Sploosh." His voice was strained as he worked on the jar. "That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat." He still couldn't get the lid off. "I found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel." Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him and grabbed the wooden end of the shovel and held it out to Zero, blade first. "Sometimes you just have to," Zero said, and then hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the jagged edges before it spilled. "Careful," Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off as well, and then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. "Drink some." Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized, it must have been in the boat when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it? I want you to think about what could be in this container and why. "It's good," said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed over his dry mouth and down his parched throat. So parched means you're kind of dried out with heat. Whenever you're very thirsty, your throat will feel dry. You can say it's parched. He thought it might have been some kind of fruit at some time. Perhaps, is it on the tip of your tongue? Peaches. I want you to think about why. Zero smiled at him. "I told you it was good." Who made preserved jarred peaches? Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. How many are left? He asked. None, said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. Now I have to take you back, he said. I'm not digging any more holes, said Zero. They won't make you dig, Stanley promised. They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barfbag. Barfbag stepped on a rattlesnake, said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear the rattle. He did it on purpose, said Zero. You think? He took off his shoe and sock first. Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. What's Maryalu? Asked Zero. What? Zero concentrated hard. Maryalu. I have no idea. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled back out from under the boat. Stanley followed. Back outside, he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters. Ooh. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Zero repeated, studying the letters. I thought Y made the Y sound. It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of a word. Sometimes Y is just a vowel, and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Are you all right? Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side with his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back toward Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning, and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I got a plan so you won't get in trouble, Stanley reassured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy, making us dig where she thought X-Ray found it. I think if I tell the warden where I really found it, she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He had come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off to the distance. I want you to look at something. I just want you to look at the mountain up there. See the one that has something sticking out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing, but as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed a fist. He raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand and then back to the mountain. Boys and girls, thank you for listening. Chapters 31 to 35 of Holes. See you soon.